Salutations, fam. This is Arim from Haltessiagaming, and in today's video, I'm going to be kind of talking about, things to keep in mind if you're being a budget player. You want to be a successful competitive player, but you are a budget player. So one thing I want to get out of the way is that, I'm not really going to talk about a specific budget, and apply like a numerical value to it, but more so just going to be talking about like how to make the most out of limited resources because everyone's budget is different, and I wanted to have this be something that can just be kind of applied just in general rather than it just being like, okay, here's a deck that you can play if you're on a budget, because the reality is that like those kind of things fluctuate very heavily. um and it changes from format to format. Very often, if a deck gets really popular because it's good and it's cheap, then well, very often it stops being cheap because at that point everyone wants it, so that drives up the demand, which drives up the price, and blah 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 blah. So yeah, without further ado, I'm just going to kind of focus on like these five different points. I'm going to go in depth on them, but the 5 points I'm going to talk about in this video are: first off, you want to focus on long-term play, rather than just like short-term, because that's one of the biggest difference I feel in regards to being a budget player, is that like you're going to be in it for the long game, right? You want to be able to focus on increasing your playable card pool. You want to keep your bulk. And you want to avoid buying things when it's really popular, because as I mentioned earlier, if something is really popular, then that drives up the demand, which drives up the price. And the last point that I'm going to talk about is the fact that power crept cards are often still good and still really strong. So without further ado, I'm going to get right into it and start on the next topic, which is going to be focusing on like playing it for the long term. So yeah, one of the biggest things about being a budget player is usually that like you're not really going to be able to make those like big purchases. You're going to have to be saving up to get cards. It's going to take you a lot longer to build certain things. Because one of the big things that I feel a lot of people misunderstand about being a budget player is that like if you're a budget player, that means you can never have expensive cards, but that's not really how it works. A lot of times you will be able to have powerful cards. Sometimes you will even be able to have like really expensive cards. But just that your approach to how you get cards in the game and like how you build your decks and everything will be different. So, firstly, I want to say like you want to focus on buying cards that will be like good in multiple decks. This usually is stuff like staples. You're going to get a lot more mileage out of staples than you will out of getting like a card that's necessary to play like a specific deck. Like for example, using Salamangreat as an example, paying for a Salamangreat Gazelle will not take you as far in your competitive career as buying something like a Mystical Space Typhoon or a Twin Twisters or a Cosmic Cyclone. Because the thing about like cards that are staples is that you'll be able to throw them in pretty much every single deck that you will play. Just period. Like there's never going to be a situation where you're like, okay, I can't play this card in this deck, right? It will always be able to serve that card role. So you want to try and focus on, at least in the beginning, getting cards that will be good in multiple decks. You want to get your staples. You want to get your like splashable engines and things like that. Next point on this topic, you want to wait for reprint cycles. A lot of the time, expensive cards don't usually stay expensive. Usually they will either fall out of the meta and get cheaper. They'll get reprinted and get cheaper, things like that. Usually the best time to get cards is like shortly after it's been reprinted, because I actually forgot to put this on here, but like you definitely don't want to avoid buying at pre-sale most of the time, because usually it'll get cheaper after pre-sales. Usually buying on pre-sale is not the way to go. I would say a good example of this is like a Luber, I think on pre-sale was like what, like $50 or something like that, or like $30 or whatever. But now it's sitting at like $15 or something like that. So it's just like don't immediately get it. Just you really want to try and like wait. Um, Now, one thing I will say is that, like, yeah, the price of cards can be very random and it, like, fluctuates, but the typical pattern is, like, don't buy on pre-sale. Typically wait until like maybe a week or two after, the set releases, because at that point everyone's gotten to open up the set, pull the cards and everything, and things will usually be able to like, go down in price a little bit. People have actually been able to put it on the market as competition, all of that. So usually that's when the price will stabilize and you'll be able to pick up your copy for a decent price. And another thing is that like picking up deck cores while they're cheap, even if they're not in the meta. There's a lot of really, really good, decks in the game that a lot of people just aren't playing because they're not like the new hotness, the best deck or whatever. Because like, maybe this card isn't, maybe this deck isn't like at the top of the meta, or it's not as good as it used to be or whatever. But for whatever reason, like a deck core may be cheap, it's typically a good idea to pick up a deck core while it's cheap, if you think the deck has potential. Like, genuinely, like, you want to look at the deck and see what it like does from a conceptual standpoint, and like try to figure out like, okay, this seems like it has potential. I'll go ahead and pick this up for like maybe $20, $30. Just in general, try to pick up cheap deck cores, because that increases your playable card pool, and it also makes it so that like when new support comes out, a lot of times you might already have the deck core, so like you don't have to pay those overinflated prices. You don't have to, deal with you know, the scramble as much. You typically also like, post ban list, this is a thing that happens as well. So it's just in general like pick up deck cores while they're cheap, and that's pretty much going to be it on this part. Moving on to the next point. Increasing your playable card pool. One big thing. Yes, it is much better to have a mediocre deck that is complete than a bad deck with random power cards in it. If I'm playing, normal summon, normal monster beatdown with, 3 copies of triple tactics talents in it, right? That's going to be significantly worse than if I'm just playing an ice barrier deck, but like the deck is actually complete. It has like a consistent playable game plan, like it's got all the card rules covered, etc. It's better to have a mediocre deck that is complete than a bad deck with power cards in it. The best products for newer players or returning players when you're in this stage are going to be things like structure decks, megatins, and deck cores. I actually do not recommend buying singles at the early stage when you don't really have any cards, because of the simple fact that like a lot of times, yes, you actually will get more mileage out of just getting like a structure deck and getting 3 structure decks than if you go, well, I'm just going to buy all the singles for this Salamangreat deck or whatever, right? Because a lot of times like these type of products, they will increase your playable card pool. And the reason why that will give you more value, because again, we focus on the long term rather than the short term. For example, like when I got back into the game, I bought 6 structure decks. I bought 3 copies of the Rocket Revolt structure deck and 3 copies of the Link Strike starter deck. And I actually, to this day, 3 years later, am still getting value out of that initial purchase. Because, for example, I got the 3, structure decks because, I wanted the rockets. I wanted, like, come with the cards in there. And with the Link Strike starter decks, I got those for about $6 a copy because I wanted Draco Nets. I wanted to play a set of Draco Nets. And while, yes, singles will be cheaper than buying these types of products, but they will not be as good for you in the long term, for example, right? So I could have just bought 3 copies of Draconet at about $5 a copy, like $4 or $5 a copy. But instead, I opted to get the 3 starter decks because not only did I get those 3 Draconets, but I also ended up getting like a bunch of staple cards that increased my playable card pool. Like, I got like Effect Veilers, I got like Torrentials, I got like Supply Squad, I got like a bunch of playable cards that I was able to use to make a more, competent deck. I made my rocket control deck at the time, and it was basically, it was a rocket deck. It was more like a mid-range control deck. I played like torrentials in it. I played supply squad in it, and basically what you would do is you just kind of outgrind the opponent by flooding them with card advantage each turn, because the rockets, when they're destroyed, they replace themselves in the end phase. Combine that with cards like torrential, you can get some pretty good pluses. Combined with supply squad, you can get some pretty good pluses, and basically that was the idea behind that deck. And like if I just bought singles, yes, I would have spent less in the short term, but in the long term, for example, like those effect balers came into play, those torrentials came into play, the supply squads came into play, like just oh yeah, like the dualities came into play. Like I don't have the exact card list on me right now, but a lot of the cards that were in those decks ended up seeing play in other decks in the future way down the line. Or if you just buy the singles, a lot of times you'll just have that one deck, and if it gets hit on the ban list, you're in a much worse position. So I do think like at least in the beginning when you don't really have a card pool, it's good to get stuff like structure decks, megatons, buy deck cores rather than just like building a deck because again banless season, popularity, things like that. Because another thing with like these type of things is that like for example, with the rocket stuff, that got a lot more expensive over the years and things like that. But I'll come back to that later. But yeah, you want to focus on having all your necessary card rolls in order to have a complete deck. This means having a fully built main, extra, and side deck. You want to have all your card rolls considered. You want to have, your stuff to handle, like, going first, going second. You want to have hand traps. You want to have spell and trap removal. You want to have your extenders, things like that. You want to have, like, your protection cards, You want to make sure you have your card rolls covered so that you don't just end up in a situation where it's just like, okay, but if I run into this match, I would just auto lose because I don't have a certain card roll covered. You don't want to be in a situation where you don't have a full extra deck. You don't have a full side deck. Because yeah, that is something I definitely have noticed a lot of times with newer returning players is they don't realize the importance of the side deck. The side deck is arguably the most important aspect of playing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! You will play most of your competitive matches with your side deck in rotation. So it's just like building and completing your side deck is probably one of the most important aspects. And then we're going to move on to the next point, which is going to be to keep your bulk. Very often I also will see players who will like open up a box, not pull the chase card or whatever, and then just sell all the cards back to to the card shop or whatever, and not keep their bulk. And I think that when you are a budget player, that is not the route you want to take. You want to make sure you are keeping your bulk, because I cannot tell you how often those cards that are worthless right now end up funding later card purchases later on down the line. Very, very often cards will go up in price. It's very uncommon for a card to just stay worthless. A lot of times either maybe like some new card will come out that will make these cards a lot better, or like something will happen and the cards will spike or whatever. But typically when you're not in a position to constantly just be buying cards as they come out, you want to keep your bulk, because I can't tell you how many times where I've suddenly found out like, oh, this card is like $5 now. Wait a minute, that was in blah 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 set that I opened at certain point, and then I'll look and just be like, oh hey, I have 17 copies of this. I suddenly have $80 to work with. So it's like, and if you are going to be cutting your bulk, please make sure to like organize your card pool. You definitely don't want to be like me and have like 5,000 cards worth of bulk that you have to look through the entirety of every time you want to look for a card. You definitely want to look into getting penny sleeves. You definitely want to look into getting one of those boxes where that card shop use to like sort their cards and everything like that. You want to get your like dividers and everything. Potentially have like your hollow binders or whatever. But you want to make sure you organize your card pool, because that will make things so much easier for you in the long run, being able to just be like, oh hey, do I have this card? It starts with an E. Let me just open up my collection of all the cards that start, all the monsters that start with E. Let's look through here and see if I have it. It'll just make it so much easier for you in the long run. Also, read all the cards you get instead of just focusing on like the chase cards, because there's a lot of hidden gems in sets. One of the things I have mentioned in my deck building guys, you don't always play the best card, you play the best cards you have. There's a lot of cards that don't see play simply because they're overshadowed by something else that are actually pretty good. There's a lot of times where like these new sets will just randomly release support for like a really old archetype or whatever. And yeah, going back to the earlier one about like utilizing your card pool, I've seen a lot of returning players come back into the game not realizing how many of their old cards are still playable and how they can just be like adapted to like be modernized and things like that. For example, like let's say you play Black Wings in the day, if you Let's say you go normal summon, you activate Black Roman, you normal summon your Shura, you search your Gale, special summon your Gale, and you go into your Synchro monster or whatever, right? Well, you might think like, oh, well, I can't really play Black Wings, it's not that good, but you have to understand that like nowadays, that's a Halki Firex line, so it's like it's a lot easier to build a playable deck than people will realize, even if like you might not play a lot of these cards, a lot more cards are playable than people realize. And yeah, speaking on that, you want to really be able to experiment with different cards and builds and things like that. Really think outside of the box, because that's one of the things you're going to have to do if you're a budget player. You have to think outside of the box. You will not typically be able to play the most well-proven, dominant thing of the format, because that's usually going to be the stuff that's really expensive. You're going to be really having to think outside the box, really shift how you play, shift your deck building and things like that. You're going to be doing things like normal summon monster into a Black Roman to go into your Halki Fibrax line, because you're probably not going to be able to afford the $300 Brave Engine or whatever, right? You're going to be able to look at your old card, see what you do, look at your bulk, see what it does, and like just try to put together a playable card pool and have a consistent strategy. Remember, it's better to have a mediocre deck that is complete, competent, and playable than it is to have a bad deck with a bunch of random power cards. Moving into the next point, don't buy things when they're popular. Try to pick up cards when they're not in the meta. As I mentioned earlier, pick up your cheap deck cores and things like that. Pick up your hand traps when they're not like in the format. If you, for example, like with a lot of hand traps, like let's say we're in a format where Veiler's like in every deck, right? Veiler's going to be like $5. That's not when you pick up your Veilers. You pick up your Veilers when they're like 35 cents. So that's when you pick up your Veilers. You pick up the cards when they're not being played. You pick up the cards when they're not in the meta. It's like typically you should always be trying to pick up things like hand traps. You should always be trying to pick up things like staples and things like that. Try to pick them up when they're not in the meta. Try to pick up that deck that you are thinking about playing when it's not topping, Because very often, a lot of times people will think like, oh, well, it's not being represented, it must not be good anymore. That is not how it works. A lot of things are still really, really good, but they're just not popular right now. A lot of times that just because it's not being the most represented thing doesn't mean it's not good anymore. Yeah, by the time you're seeing a YouTube video hyping it up, it's probably already been bought out. Once you hear people talking about how it's like, a good option in this format and everyone's, scrambling to get it, that's the point where, it's probably too late. At the point where, people are already buying it out and things like that. Once everybody knows that this is the option to go for, this is the deck to beat, blah, 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 that's typically the point where things start getting bought out. That's typically the point where things are too expensive. And at that point, you probably want to wait for the hype to die down before you start purchasing the cards again. You want to wait until it, goes back out of the meta, the hype dies down, because usually, well, pretty consistently it will die down. Let's say, I don't know, some deck just won like a regional or whatever, and then everybody's talking about it. So, all the cards are getting bought out. Again, that's not the time to buy the deck. You want to wait. You either want to try and get the cards before that happens, or you want to wait until like a bit after nobody's talking about it anymore. The hype has kind of dialed down. Like, for example, like with the Predaplant stuff, right? During the YCS, the Practice, I think it was called, was like $75. And then like after the YCS, after the hype dialed down a little bit, it was like $40. And now it's died down a bit more, and now there's only $20 again, right? So it's like the best time to get stuff is before it gets showcased, because if you had the Predaplant stuff beforehand because you were interested in potentially playing the branded stuff, the Predaplant deck, because of the new Predaplant support, you would have been able to get those cards for like $2-3, But $20 is still, while it's worse than getting it for $3, it's definitely a lot better than paying $75 to get it, So yeah, you definitely want to try to, if you can, pick up cards before they're being popular. But if you can't, just wait for the hype die down a little bit, and then, pick it up when you can. And the last thing I want to point out in the video is that power creep does not mean it's bad. There's a lot of things that has genuinely been power creep, but that doesn't mean it's like not played anymore. what often is the trend in Yu-Gi-Oh is that certain things in the game are just good effects. You know, there are certain things that have always been good effects. To this day, they're still good effects. The reality is that like BLS is definitely been power crept, but targeted banish removal is still good. Being able to OTK randomly is still good. Free special summons still good. BLS is still a really strong power card. Like that's just the reality of it. It's been power crept like crazy, but it's still a good card. Dark Arm Dragon has been power crept, but it's still a good card. There's a lot of cards that have been ridiculously power crept that are still really good. For example, like the Hieratic, you know, special summon dragon from the deck to go into combo plays, right? You wouldn't think to do that with, you know, Hieratics nowadays, but the reality is that Hieratic King of Altoon is still a very powerful card. You know, it still special summons any dragon from the deck. You know, it's still very powerful. Um, Decks will often fall off because they stop evolving, and you know they fall into the standardization deck building pitfall. I talked about that previously, but basically the idea is that like in order for you to be successful, you have to constantly keep evolving with the meta. You can't fall into the mindset of, well, this is usually how it's played, and that's not working anymore, so this deck must not be good. That's not really how it works. If you want to see some consistent success, you have to constantly evolve. It's like even if you're playing the same deck, if you're still playing it the exact same way, a lot of times, it just won't be, very effective. You have to actually break down what your deck's doing and what's happening in the meta to try and figure out, like, okay, what's good in the meta right now? What are the top decks doing? Is there a way I can, like, replicate that with my deck? Because that's, typically how I always did it. I always looked at what the meta was shifting towards and what was good in that meta, and I built accordingly, for example, right? When we were in a meta where, like, people were scythe locking, I play a deck that doesn't care about the extra deck, That way, I'm not going to be affected by scythe lock, I'll be able to play cards that kind of skirt around what's popular in the meta. Yeah, so the last thing on here, it says Dark Hole still destroys all monsters. That this kind of goes into another point of you don't necessarily need the most expensive card. You just need to have all your card rules covered. You don't have to have the most expensive card. You just have to have a power card, At the end of the day, yes, Lightning Storm does destroy your opponent's back row. Yes, Lightning Storm will make it so you don't lose your skill drain. But the reality is, so does Mystical Space Typhoon. At the end of the day, if your opponent flips up skill drain and you see, okay, I need to have something for skill drain, at the end of the day, siding in Mystical Space Typhoon will still do the job. You will still be able to chain Mystical Space Typhoon to that skill drain and make your effect go through and win the game at the end of the day, Yes, the most expensive power cards are typically the best option available, but that does not mean that the cheap card is not good. At the end of the day, Dark Hole still destroys your opponent's board, what was the I can't remember, there was another one. It was like access code. So access code is that crazy extra deck boss monster that helps break boards, OTKs, win the game. Yeah, access code is that expensive $80 power card, but you want to know something? At the end of the day, Boral Sword still OTKs, Utopia Double still OTKs. Like at the end of the day, there's still options that you can go into, Crusadia, Avramax, Honest. Like at the end of the day, these old cards still have utility even if they're not the best. And usually as a budget player, that's typically what you're going to do. You're going to be playing old stuff, you're going to be playing the cheap deck of the format. You're going to be playing older decks that have been power crept, but they're still good, A lot of times, old stuff doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means it's not the best option anymore. And that's fine because, at the end of the day, you don't necessarily need the best option to compete. You just need a competitive option to compete, And I don't just say this to kind of like give false hope, but it's like, because one of the things that I feel like I should have mentioned in the beginning of the video, but I actually have always been a budget player. This may come as a surprise because I have a lot of expensive cards, but I've always been a budget player. I just have followed these tips. I've always been a budget player. I think like the most I've ever spent on a card was like I bought Lightning Storms, right? I bought Lightning Storms. But like the thing about that is that, that was a very unique circumstance. I got like a insurance check. And so I was able to spend a little bit of money to like get some power cards. But like that was very recent, that was like this year. Um but for the entirety of my time playing Yu-Gi-Oh back in 2002 to 2013 to 2019 to now, like I've pretty much been a budget player. Like being able to have three prosperities isn't because I shelled out $500 to get a play set of prosperity. It's because, I pulled one, I traded for one. It's just like, things like that. It's like just because you're a budget player doesn't mean you won't ever have expensive cards. And like again, I keep my bulk. I remember one of the big ones was that I remember there was a point where Jirac Aeolo got like saw a price jump because like Synchro Dino was really popular or whatever. And so Jirac Aeolos were like, I want to say $10, $15 or something like that. And if for those of you who don't know, Jirac Aeolo was a pretty easy to pull super rare from Hidden Arsenal 4, which was a set I opened back in the day. So when I saw that they were like $10, $15 and that it was from Hidden Arsenal 4, I was like, wait a minute, I opened that set. Let me see if I have those. And I had like 8 copies of it. So suddenly, I was able to sell them and, use that money to get new stuff and things like that. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's very important to keep your bulk and things like that. And one of the reasons why I think it's important to focus on the long term. You're not going to be able to just, right out the gate have like the best deck of the format or whatever, but it's just like being able to, take that time over time and slowly build up your deck, things like that. You want to, get those cheap deck cores and things like that. Because like for me, for example, like I didn't buy Dragon Link when it was like the best deck of the format and everything was like, the deck was like $800, When I bought Dragon Link, it was like $200 for everything, and even then, I didn't buy it all at once. I built it over the course of like 2 months or something like that. Just slowly but surely, like getting the pieces, making my deck better by better, week after week, and things like that. And that's, just in general. If I had to summarize everything I've mentioned, the basic mindset is understanding that it's going to take a bit longer for you to build a powerful deck in comparison to other players. But that doesn't mean you're not going to be able to. At the end of the day, if you enter a tournament, you're going to get those OTS packs, And the OTS packs, sometimes, yeah, you will pull that, that ultimate rare that you can sell and get like a huge jump on your journey of building a deck. You'll be able to pull. Maybe there's an ultimate rare version of a card that you needed for your deck. Like for example, if you guys will recognize, you'll notice I play an ultimate rare Halki Fibrax, for example. I remember when Forbidden Droplet was in the OTS packs, I wanted to potentially pull a ultimate rare Forbidden Droplet just so I could have a droplet, and a lot of times like you'll be able to sell those cards as well because like the OTS Supers, at least when that OTS pack goes out of rotation, a lot of times those cards will go up in value and things like that. But it's just in general, keep your stuff because it goes like Yu-Gi-Oh cards just tend to go up. Understand that you're playing the long game. Understand that you're playing the long game. Be more resourceful, and yeah, I think that's pretty much all that I have to say on it for today, at least. I do still want to make a video talking about like decks I can suggest for right now. One of the big ones that I can think of is like picking up the Albaz structure decks and picking up the Eldritch Core because those are like really cheap right now. But yeah, just in general, that's gonna be it for today's video. Remember, guys, check out my description. I usually have good stuff in there. It's usually linked to helpful videos related to the topic. It's usually, I've got like links to stuff in there as well. If you like the video, leave a comment, like the video, subscribe, all that good stuff. This has been Arim from Haltessiagaming. Thank you very much for watching, and have a wonderful day. Oh no, the button.